The wind whips across the cracked earth, a fine, gritty dust stinging your eyes and catching in your throat. This isn't the desert you imagine, it's a graveyard. Rusting hulks of fishing trawlers, once proud vessels of a thriving industry, now lie marooned in an endless expanse of white, salt-encrusted sand. Their bows point defiantly towards a horizon that once held water, miles and miles of it, but now offers only the shimmer of heat haze. A lone child, no older than 7, picks at the skeletal remains of a fish, its scales long since scoured away by the relentless elements, its bones bleached brittle. The air is thick with the metallic tang of salt and decay, a stark testament to something profound and terrible that happened here. Beneath your feet, the ground is not merely dry soil, but a toxic cocktail of pesticides and fertilizers, blown in by the same winds that carry whispers of a forgotten sea. This desolation stretches as far as the eye can see, a monument to absence. There are no waves, no cries of gulls, only the mournful groan of corroding metal and the endless, sifting sound of sand. This was once the world's 4th largest inland body of water, a vibrant blue jewel on the map. Now it is little more than a memory, a phantom limb on the planet's surface. What could possibly have caused such an unimaginable erasure? To understand how this desolation came to be, we must first rewind the clock back to a time when the Aral Sea was a source of life, not death. Imagine the early 1950s. The air hummed with the vibrant activity of coastal towns like Moynac, nestled on the southern shore of what was then a vast, sparkling expanse of freshwater. The sea stretched for over 420 kilometers, covering an area larger than the entirety of Ireland, a shimmering inland ocean. Fishermen, their faces weathered by sun and spray, would launch their wooden boats from bustling docks, returning later with holds overflowing with prized Aral barbel, bream, carp, and sturgeon. The smell of fresh fish mingled with the scent of brine and damp nets, a pervasive perfume of prosperity. Processing plants operated day and night, canning and salting fish for export across the Soviet Union, providing thousands of jobs and sustaining families for generations. Children learned to swim in its clear, cool waters, and local folklore was rich with tales of its bountiful depths. The 2 great rivers of Central Asia, the Amu Darya and the Sur Darya, fed the Aral Sea, carrying melted snow from distant Pamir and Tian Shan mountains, nourishing its ecosystems and maintaining its majestic volume. This was a thriving ecosystem, a lifeline for millions, not just a geographical feature, but a vital part of the cultural and economic fabric of the Uzbek and Kazakh Soviet Socialist republics. This rich, flourishing landscape, vibrant with life and ancient rhythms, held no hint of the catastrophe that lay just over the horizon, a future no one could have possibly foreseen. The seeds of the Aral Sea's destruction were sown in the grand, ambitious plans hatched in Moscow. In the early 20th century, particularly after the establishment of the Soviet Union, a fervent ideology of man's dominance over nature took hold. Central planners envisioned transforming arid Central Asian republics into a global agricultural powerhouse, believing that with enough will and engineering, any natural obstacle could be overcome. By the 1930s under Stalin, and escalating dramatically through the 1950s and 60s under leaders like Nikita Khrushchev, the directive was clear: make the desert bloom. The primary crop chosen for this colossal endeavor was cotton, which Joseph Stalin famously called white gold. Cotton, a water-intensive plant, required massive irrigation in the naturally dry climate of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. To achieve this, engineers drew up plans to divert the 2 mighty rivers that fed the Aral Sea, the Amu Darya and the Sur Darya. Gigantic irrigation canals, some stretching hundreds of kilometers, were meticulously designed and then dug, often by forced labor, to carry river water to vast new cotton fields. The scale of this project was staggering. The Karakum Canal, for instance, constructed over decades, became one of the longest irrigation canals in the world, diverting immense volumes of the Amu Darya. The goal was to boost Soviet cotton production exponentially, making the Soviet Union self-sufficient and a major exporter. This was not a small-scale experiment, it was a national priority, a cornerstone of Soviet economic policy, a direct challenge to nature itself. The men in power saw the Aral Sea as a mistake of nature, a wasteful evaporation pan, and its eventual shrinkage was not merely foreseen but, for some, even welcomed as a necessary sacrifice for progress. The initial changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to those not intimately connected with the sea. In the late 1960s, a few years after the major diversions of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya began in earnest, fishermen in Moynak and Aralsk started to notice something amiss. The water level seemed a little lower each year. Boats that once docked directly at the bustling quays now required a longer walk over newly exposed mudflats. Captains of larger vessels found their accustomed routes becoming shallower, forcing them to navigate more cautiously through channels that had once been deep and clear. Local residents, accustomed to the seasonal fluctuations of the sea, initially dismissed these observations. "It's just a dry year," they might have said, or "the rivers are low from the mountain melt." However, the fishing catches began to dwindle not just in quantity but in variety. The valuable sturgeon, sensitive to salinity changes, became rarer, replaced by hardier, less desirable species. Elder fishermen like one Akelbek Rakimov, who had fished the Aral since his youth, voiced concerns to local authorities, reporting that his nets were coming back with less and less, and the once familiar coastline was retreating a few meters each year. These complaints, however, were largely ignored by regional officials, who were under immense pressure from Moscow to meet agricultural quotas. Any reports of environmental problems were seen as inconvenient truths, potential threats to the success of the Cotton Plan. The Soviet press, tightly controlled, certainly offered no hint of impending ecological crisis. The slow retreat of the Aral Sea was deemed a minor side effect, a negligible cost in the grand scheme of Soviet progress, a problem that would surely fix itself. But this was merely the first ripple of a much larger, more devastating wave. What began as a slow retreat quickly accelerated into a terrifying rout. By the mid-1970s, the changes were impossible to ignore. Moynak, once a thriving port city, found itself miles from the water's edge. Its fishing fleet, numbering hundreds of vessels, was suddenly landlocked, transforming the bustling docks into a morbid spectacle of stranded, rusting hulks. The once clear blue waters turned murky and increasingly saline, exceeding the salt content of the open ocean in some areas. This unprecedented rise in salinity wiped out most of the remaining fish species, decimating an industry that had employed over 60,000 people across the region. Fishermen, their livelihoods evaporated overnight, were forced to abandon their homes or seek work in the cotton fields, the very industry that had robbed them of their sea. The scale of the environmental degradation was becoming undeniable. The rivers, the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, which historically delivered 50-60 cubic kilometers of water to the Aral Sea annually, were now contributing barely 5 cubic kilometers, sometimes less. Over 90% of their flow was being diverted for irrigation. This colossal mismanagement created not only a shrinking sea, but also a vast, newly exposed seabed of approximately 50,000 square kilometers. This former seabed was not fertile land. It was a barren expanse of sand, salt, and highly toxic residues from the pesticides and chemical fertilizers used in the cotton fields. The very thing that should have stopped it, the increasing evidence of devastation, was systematically dismissed by Soviet authorities. A report filed by the Ministry of Water Management in 1978, detailing the dire projections for the sea's future and recommending reduced diversions, was quietly shelved, deemed an impediment to agricultural targets. The dream of white gold was now literally turning the landscape white, covered in a shimmering, poisonous crust of salt. And this was just the beginning of the true nightmare. As the water receded further through the 1980s, a second, far more insidious wave of catastrophe began to engulf the region. The exposed seabed, now a vast, desolate Aral desert, became a persistent source of toxic dust storms. Every year, millions of tons of this lethal dust, laden with salt, chemical pesticides like DDT, and defoliants used in the cotton fields, were picked up by the wind and carried for hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. These storms were not merely an inconvenience, they were a public health disaster. Rates of respiratory illnesses, including chronic bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis, soared among the local population. Cancers of the throat and esophagus, kidney and liver diseases, and debilitating eye conditions became alarmingly prevalent. Infant mortality rates in Karakalpakstan, the autonomous republic within Uzbekistan where Moynak is located, reached some of the highest levels in the world, with 1 in 10 babies not surviving past their first birthday by 1988. Children were born with birth defects at rates far exceeding the national average. Dr. Zoabek Abdaliyev, a local physician in Nukus, the capital of Karakalpakstan, meticulously documented the escalating health crisis, sending increasingly urgent reports to regional medical authorities, only to be met with bureaucratic silence or outright dismissal. The local environment was in ruin. Crop yields in surrounding areas plummeted due to the salt deposition, groundwater became contaminated, and the unique flora and fauna of the Aral Delta region, once a natural sanctuary, vanished. The climate itself began to change. The absence of the large body of water meant hotter summers and colder winters, creating harsher conditions for everyone. The official narrative from Moscow continued to focus on agricultural output, presenting rosy pictures of bumper cotton harvests, while the reality on the ground screamed a different story entirely. Something didn't add up between the proclaimed success and the visible, horrifying degradation of life itself. Everything pointed towards a colossal miscalculation, a tragic accident of overzealous planning and unforeseen consequences. The story often told was one of innocent ambition gone terribly wrong, of engineers simply not grasping the scale of nature's delicate balance. But then in the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began its slow, painful unraveling, a different, far more chilling truth started to emerge. It wasn't an accident, at least not in the conventional sense. The Soviet leadership knew. Declassified documents and the testimonies of former Soviet officials and hydrologists revealed years later painted a stark picture. The shrinkage and eventual destruction of the Aral Sea was not merely a tragic oversight, but a calculated, deliberate sacrifice. As early as 1960, high-ranking officials in the Ministry of Land Reclamation and Water Management, and even within the Communist Party Central Committee, were presented with detailed hydrological reports forecasting the precise rate at which the Aral Sea would diminish if irrigation quotas for cotton were maintained or increased. These reports, often stamped for internal use only, clearly stated that a substantial portion, if not all, of the Aral Sea's volume would be lost within decades. The choice was presented as an economic dilemma: either continue the ambitious cotton expansion, guaranteeing agricultural self-sufficiency and export revenue, or preserve the Aral Sea and risk food shortages and economic stagnation in the Central Asian republics. The decision was made. The Aral Sea was deemed a dispensable resource, its evaporation considered inefficient in comparison to the productive use of its feeder rivers. This was the dark heart of the plan, a conscious decision to trade a natural wonder for agricultural output with full knowledge of the environmental and human cost. It was a trade-off that would haunt generations, forever changing the face of a continent. The revelation of deliberate choice goes deeper than mere acknowledgement of risk. It exposes the bureaucratic mechanisms by which the sacrifice was rationalized and implemented. Soviet hydrologists and economists meticulously modeled the future, not just of cotton yields, but of the Aral Sea itself. They produced projections in the late 1950s and early 1960s, like those from the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, and the Institute of Water Problems, that accurately predicted the sea's division into smaller, hypersaline basins and its eventual disappearance by the early 21st century. These were not speculative guesses, but calculations based on projected irrigation expansion rates. The detail nobody talks about is that these scientific findings were then used not to prevent the disaster, but to justify it within the framework of socialist planning. The Aral Sea's inefficiency in evaporating valuable river water was highlighted. It was framed as an economic burden, a natural anomaly that held back the region's agricultural potential. The argument was simple, albeit brutal. If the water evaporated from the Aral Sea, it produced nothing. If it was diverted to cotton fields, it produced wealth for the Soviet Union. This cold utilitarian calculus dictated policy. Committees debated not if the sea would die, but how quickly, and what the optimal rate of its dehydration would be to maximize agricultural output. The human and ecological costs were not unknown, but were deemed acceptable collateral damage, relegated to footnotes in internal reports. The centralized, top-down nature of the Soviet system meant that once a decision was made by the Politburo, it filtered down through ministries and republics, becoming an unquestionable directive. Local dissent, scientific warnings, or environmental concerns were simply steamrolled by the imperative of the 5-year plans. The very efficiency of the Soviet planning apparatus became its most destructive tool, meticulously orchestrating a grand environmental tragedy, all for the sake of a single crop. The path was set, irreversible, and deliberately paved. The abstract numbers and political decisions translated into a profoundly tangible loss for individuals like Aral Sea. Born in 1948 in the fishing village of Urga, on the southern shore of the Aral Sea, Aral grew up with the rhythm of the waves and the bounty of the waters. He started working on fishing boats as a teenager, learning the nets and the currents, fully expecting to follow his father and grandfather into the family trade. His earliest memories are of a sea so vast and deep that storms could rival those of any ocean, waves crashing against the shore with thunderous power. He remembers the joyful shouts of children playing along the sandy beaches, the bustling docks of Moynak where his catches were sold, and the communal pride in the region's rich fishing industry. But as the 1970s bled into the 80s, Aral watched his world literally disappear. The water receded first by meters, then by kilometers, until Urga, his childhood home, was left high and dry, a ghost village on a desert of salt. He tried to adapt, moving his fishing boat further out, only to find the new shoreline also retreating, mocking his efforts. By the early 1980s, his boat, named Hope, was irrevocably stranded, a monument to a lost way of life. Aral lost his livelihood, his community dispersed as people sought work elsewhere, and his health began to decline. He suffered from chronic respiratory issues, his lungs damaged by the toxic dust storms that swept through his former home. His children and grandchildren also bore the brunt, with higher rates of illnesses and birth defects, a direct consequence of the poisoned environment. Aral Sea, now in his late 70s, still lives near the desiccated remnants of the sea, a silent witness to its demise, his eyes holding the profound grief of someone who has watched his entire world vanish. He often says, "My sea was alive." Now it is just a memory that haunts the wind. His story is not unique, it is the shared tragedy of millions. In the tightly controlled environment of the Soviet Union, the catastrophe unfolding at the Aral Sea was not just ignored, it was systematically suppressed. The official narrative maintained a facade of success, prioritizing cotton yields over environmental truth. Any dissenting voices or alarming reports were actively silenced. For decades, access to the region was heavily restricted for foreign journalists and independent scientists. Internal Soviet documents that detailed the environmental damage or projected the sea's demise were classified and locked away in archives. One particularly striking example of this suppression involved the Ministry of Land Reclamation and Water Resources. From 1970 onwards, directives were issued to omit any mention of Aral Sea water level decline from public hydrological surveys and official statistical yearbooks. Instead, sections related to the Aral Sea simply ceased to exist, or figures were manipulated to suggest minor, non-alarming fluctuations. Academics or researchers who attempted to publish findings on the sea's shrinking or the accompanying health crisis faced severe professional repercussions, including dismissal, denial of funding, and even accusations of anti-Soviet propaganda. Dr. Mikhail Zalogin, a geographer who attempted to raise concerns in the early 1980s, found his research funding abruptly cut and his articles rejected from scientific journals, effectively silencing him. Furthermore, the Soviet State Committee for Hydrometeorology stopped collecting detailed, publicly accessible data on the Aral Sea's water balance entirely, making it nearly impossible for outside observers to grasp the true extent of the devastation. What was hidden was not a single, isolated incident, but a systemic, decades-long campaign of censorship and misinformation designed to maintain the illusion of progress and to avoid accountability for a colossal environmental blunder. The official silence was as vast and empty as the receding sea itself. The truth about the Aral Sea's fate only began to fully surface after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the Iron Curtain of secrecy lifted. International organizations and independent researchers finally gained access to the devastated region in previously classified Soviet archives. Led by tenacious hydrologists like Dr. Nikolay Aladin from the Zoological Institute in St. Petersburg, and geographers such as Dr. Philip Micklin from Western Michigan University, a comprehensive investigation was launched. One crucial piece of evidence they unearthed was a series of internal Soviet planning documents from the 1960s, specifically those from the Gidroprojekt Hydroproject Institute, which had meticulously outlined the irrigation expansion plans. These documents contain not just blueprints for canals, but also detailed hydrological models that explicitly predicted the Aral Sea's demise, often with surprising accuracy regarding timelines and water level drops. Another powerful lead followed by investigators was the analysis of newly available satellite imagery. When juxtaposed with older Soviet-era maps and aerial photographs, these images graphically illustrated the catastrophic shrinkage over decades, allowing scientists to track the precise rate of the sea's retreat and the expansion of the Aral Desert. Furthermore, on-the-ground soil sample analyses revealed alarming concentrations of persistent organic pollutants, primarily DDT and other agricultural chemicals, consistent with decades of intensive cotton farming and irrigation runoff. These chemicals were found in the exposed seabed and in the dust storms, directly linking the agricultural practices to the health crisis. The scientific community also meticulously analyzed river flow data, demonstrating the dramatic reduction in water reaching the Aral Sea, correlating directly with the increased diversion rates for irrigation. This multifaceted investigation, drawing on historical documents, remote sensing, and environmental sampling, systematically dismantled the long-standing official narrative. It wasn't just a sea that had been lost, but decades of crucial information deliberately buried, only now brought to light by determined scientific inquiry. For years, particularly during the era of Soviet control, the official explanation for the Aral Sea's diminishing size was carefully crafted to deflect responsibility. The most common narrative put forth by Soviet authorities was that the shrinkage was primarily due to natural climate fluctuations and unforeseen drought conditions in the Central Asian river basins. This explanation, often echoed by state-controlled media and some compliant academics like geographer S.L. Riznishenko, in his 1975 publication, Water Resources of Central Asia, suggested that the Aral Sea had a long history of natural expansion and contraction, implying its current state was simply part of a larger, uncontrollable cycle. However, this official line crumbles under the weight of concrete facts. While natural climate variability certainly exists, the sheer, unprecedented scale and speed of the Aral Sea's retreat, especially from the 1960s onwards, cannot be attributed to natural causes alone. The most glaring contradiction was the undeniable, visible presence of the massive irrigation infrastructure. Miles of concrete canals, thousands of kilometers of feeder channels, and countless diversion structures were not natural phenomena. They were monumental feats of engineering designed to siphon off nearly 90% of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya's flow before it ever reached the sea. The sheer volume of water being diverted, up to 100 cubic kilometers annually by the 1980s, dwarfed any natural deficit. Furthermore, hydrological records, once declassified, showed no corresponding severe, sustained droughts in the feeder river regions that could account for such a drastic reduction in water inflow. The official explanation was a smokescreen, designed to obscure the deliberate policy decisions that prioritized agricultural expansion above all else. It attempted to frame a man-made catastrophe as an act of nature, effectively absolving the central planners of any culpability. The desertification was not an act of God, it was an act of government, meticulously planned and executed. The most credible theory, one overwhelmingly supported by decades of post-Soviet research and declassified documents, points to the intentional dehydration, or calculated sacrifice of the Aral Sea. This theory, championed by leading experts such as Dr. Philip Micklin, a geographer who dedicated decades to studying the Aral Sea, and numerous researchers from the Uzbek Academy of Sciences post-1991, posits that the Soviet leadership knowingly and deliberately sacrificed the sea for the sake of cotton production. The evidence backing this is multifaceted and compelling. Firstly, the existence of those aforementioned hydrological models and planning documents from the 1960s, which clearly predicted the sea's demise under the planned irrigation schemes, serves as irrefutable proof of foreknowledge. These weren't guesses, they were scientifically derived projections. Secondly, there is a direct and dramatic correlation between the exponential increase in cotton cultivation in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan from the 1960s to the 1980s, and the equally dramatic decline in the Aral Sea's water levels. As cotton acreage expanded and the demand for irrigation water soared, the sea receded. No other factor, natural or otherwise, shows such a precise and devastating linkage. Thirdly, internal Communist Party memos revealed after the Soviet collapse explicitly discussed the trade-off between preserving the Aral Sea and achieving agricultural targets. These documents indicated that while the ecological and social consequences were acknowledged, they were ultimately deemed an acceptable price for what Moscow considered strategic economic gains. One such memo from 1968 from the Politburo to the Central Asian Party committees effectively prioritized the cotton plan over any environmental concerns, instructing local authorities to ensure maximum water diversion efficiency for agriculture, with no mention of preserving the Aral. This was not an accident of ignorance, but a deliberate act of policy, an authoritarian state consciously choosing to dismantle a natural wonder for a perceived economic advantage, rendering it one of the most stark examples of anthropogenic environmental destruction in history. The Aral Sea disaster is more than just a cautionary tale of environmental neglect. It is a chilling testament to the long-term, devastating consequences of human hubris and centralized indifference. The single most disturbing fact in this entire story is not merely that a sea vanished or that millions of people suffered, but the profound and irreversible impact it has had on the regional climate, transforming the very air the remaining inhabitants breathe and influencing weather patterns far beyond Central Asia. The absence of the vast body of water which once moderated local temperatures has led to extreme climate shifts. Summers are now up to 10 degrees C hotter and winters 10 degrees C colder than before, creating an increasingly uninhabitable environment. The desiccated seabed, now a toxic wasteland, is responsible for annual dust storms that carry an estimated 100 million tons of poisoned sand and salt across thousands of square kilometers. These storms, laden with highly carcinogenic pesticides like DDT and industrial chemicals, are not just a local problem. They have been detected as far away as the Arctic, transported by global wind currents. Traces of Aral Sea dust have been found in the blood of penguins in Antarctica and in glaciers in Norway, a terrifying testament to the global reach of a regional catastrophe. This means that decisions made by a handful of bureaucrats in Moscow half a century ago are still directly impacting the health of ecosystems and living beings across the entire planet. The Aral Sea is not just a localized tragedy. It is a monument to how drastically humanity can alter the planet's fundamental systems, unleashing a cascade of consequences that respects no borders and offers no easy solutions. It is a man-made desert that continues to poison the world. The story of the Aral Sea is a stark, enduring lesson, a silent scream across the Central Asian plains. It tells us about the incredible vulnerability of even the largest natural systems to human intervention, particularly when that intervention is driven by unchecked ambition and political dogma. It reminds us of the profound responsibility that comes with the power to reshape landscapes and the often unforeseen, long-term consequences that can ripple through generations and across continents. The tragedy of the Aral Sea is not just a chapter in Soviet history, it is a universal warning. It forces us to confront the ethical dimensions of economic development, the true cost of progress when environmental stewardship is abandoned, and the chilling ease with which inconvenient truths can be suppressed and human suffering rationalized away. While some efforts are now being made to partially restore portions of the North Aral Sea through international cooperation, the vast majority of the former sea is gone forever, a permanent scar on the Earth's surface. It stands as a powerful testament to the fact that even accidental destruction, when born from deliberate policy, can unleash horrors that dwarf even the most deliberate acts of war. The ghost of the Aral Sea continues to remind us that some mistakes cannot be undone, and that the choices we make today about our environment have an echo that reverberates for centuries. If this kept you up at night, subscribe. We post dark history every week.